Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Sharing Power, a frank discussion between funders and grantees. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you here for the first time, I'm so glad you're joining us today. My name is Yvonne Sims, Programs Manager for Candid based in Atlanta, and I'm joined by Savannah Cathers, also based in Atlanta. We'll be supporting today's webinar behind the scenes, as well as collecting questions you ask along the way and posing them during the Q&A. And now I'd like to turn it over to Lowell Weiss. Lowell Weiss has spent more than 3 decades working to spark social change across a broad array of local, national, and global issues. At Cascade Philanthropy Advisors, he provides personalized guidance to donors seeking to deepen their impact and achieve greater purpose, meaning, and joy. He is a proud member of the LEAP Ambassadors community, a group of top nonprofit and philanthropic leaders committed to making high performance the norm in the social sector. Previously, he served in a leadership role at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Among his many responsibilities, he served as staff director of the internal team responsible for providing Bill and Melinda Gates with insights on how to make the highest and best use of Warren Buffett's historic gift. Prior to the Gates Foundation, he served as director of the chairman's office at the Marino Institute, dedicated to improving the lives of children in the National Capital Region. As a special assistant to the President Clinton White House, Lowell traveled extensively with the president, wrote more than 150 speeches for him, and served as a key communications strategist. He previously wrote speeches for Vice President Al Gore, wrote a New York Times best-selling book with political consultant James Carville, and served as an editor at The Atlantic Monthly. He graduated in 1990 from Amherst College with honors. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lowell Weiss.
Yvonne, thank you so much. I really wish I could see everyone's faces today. It's great to see the 4 faces of the presenters today, but I really wish I could see everyone on a Brady Bunch screen. So Yvonne, thank you for the introduction. I will just say you left one thing off that long and lovely list, and that is just how much I effing love my job. I get to work every single day with leaders like the ones that you all see in front of you to interact with these high EQ, high IQ, big heart, big brain leaders, to learn from them. And every once in a while, I get to play sort of a very pale imitation of Oprah, coaxing out wonderful stories from these leaders who have insights that can help us all learn and improve, help our entire sector learn and improve. So that's a role that I don't do often, but I really, really enjoy it.
I'm going to need you to add "you effing love your job" to your bio, okay?
I will.
Thank you.
To do it. I actually know how to change stuff on my bio these days.
Perfect.
I mean, on my own little website. That's a big improvement. So what we promised today was a frank conversation. So that's my job in my pale imitation of Oprah mode, to try to really keep it real, keep it 100, because, you know, let's face it, in our sector, we often engage in euphemism. We're often a little too polite. We're here to talk about a really tough subject, and that is sharing power. When it happens, when it doesn't happen. We were having a really cool chat just before you all had the benefit of joining with us, and a number of interesting new dimensions came out in that chat that I will bring out in this conversation. But I just want to promise there's nothing preset, prefigured, no parallel play going to happen here. We're really in conversation with each other, and I promise to fulfill that. Now I really want to introduce you to the folks we have here. You've all seen CVs and resumes, so I'm not going to do that. What I want to do, and what's more important, is to really introduce you to who these people are, not just what the amazing things that they've accomplished. I'm going to start with Hillary, just because I've known Hillary the longest. We go back, our relationship dates back to working together at the Gates Foundation. We've known each other for at least 15 years now. And the way we got to know each other initially was when we were working on that effort that Yvonne mentioned around how to make highest and best use of that Warren Buffett gift. And the thing that really stands out for me in working with Hillary in that group is that she positively was the smartest person in the room, our summa cum laude Yale graduate here. But, and here's the best part, Hillary, you never had to prove that you were the smartest person in the room, which to me is the essence of wonderful leadership. And you all will see that on display vividly today. Hillary, thank you for making time for this. I do have a perspective on how busy your plate is, so thank you so much for making time for this. Next person I'd love to introduce you to is Maria Elena Incapié, who is the executive director of the National Immigration Law Center. She herself is a lawyer with great expertise in immigration-related issues, as you of course can imagine, poverty, employment and labor issues. She came into her role at just the hardest time imaginable, which was 2008, when the bottom was falling out, and she really got to see the power sharing in multiple ways during that very difficult period when she stepped up to that leadership role. She had been with the organization since 2000, but came into the executive director role in 2008. She is the youngest, big family, youngest of 10 children, originally from Colombia. I think you immigrated to the US when you were about 3 years old. Am I getting that right? Came to the United States when her parents were recruited to work in textile factories in Rhode Island. And she became, as someone who was growing up in the United States and of course became very, very fluent with English very, very quickly, she became an interpreter, not only for her family, her parents, but also for their co-workers in the textile factories, helping them navigate systems that were really stacked against immigrants and people of color. And it gave her a very early appreciation for how systemic some of these challenges are. And I know that you still use those interpretation skills to this day, whether it's sort of building bridges across generations or communities or movements. I know that's still something that's very important part of your current work, and I really appreciate your being here. Next, I want to introduce you to Sam Cobbs. Sam and my relationship goes back at least 10 or 11 years. Sam is now the CEO of Tipping Point Community, as I think you all have seen, an important funder in San Francisco. But I got to know Sam when he was in the role of CEO of a nonprofit called First Place for Youth. Very, very good organization working with some very vulnerable kids, young people, I shouldn't say kids. The first thing that we worked on together was an effort, you can't quite see it, it's just over here, just a little bit to my right, to help create some definitions of what high performance is in the nonprofit sector and what it could be, what it takes to get there, what funders need to do to step up to help their grantees get there. And I've never said this to you before, Sam, but every time we were working on the details behind that first pillar that we call the preeminent pillar, which is courageous and adaptive leadership, Sam was the person I always had in my mind every time I was sitting there typing at my keyboard. He has made so many brave decisions that I know I personally do not have the courage to make, to open the books, to really look at outcomes, look at all kinds of aspects of finances in ways that really put him at risk with a number of his funders. And he'll probably share a few stories because the handout that Yvonne mentioned includes some of those stories from that period. Last but not least, definitely not least, is Martha Ryan, who is the executive director and founder 32 years ago of the Homeless Prenatal Program in San Francisco. And she's also a family nurse practitioner by training. Martha, when I learned that I was going to have the honor of meeting Martha and facilitating this conversation, I reached out to my oldest and dearest friend in the world, who's an obstetrician in San Francisco, and I figured she must know Martha. And sure enough, not only does she know Martha, she absolutely adores Martha, and they've worked very closely together over the years. And just to embarrass Martha just a tiny bit, I'm just going to read to you from some of the notes I took when my dear friend Deb Cohan was telling me about you and what makes you tick. So she said, she is the most generous and grounded visionary I have ever met. When I first met her, I remember thinking this woman is so, and effing again, down to earth, and gets stuff done in a beautifully collaborative way. She's a change agent who's not just tuned into what's happening in the world, but also beautifully attuned to the person sitting across from her. I just love her. And Martha, I have to say, I am a little bit jealous of that praise because this is my BFF here, and she has never said anything nearly that nice about me. So you are clearly in a very, very special category. So thank you all so much for being here. We're going to get into questions, but I do need to just do a little context setting. The reason why Yvonne and Savannah and their colleagues at Candid Learning asked us to do this webinar is because they had read the handout, the Funding Performance Monograph. It's called Funding Performance: How Great Donors Invest in Grantee Success. So it's really about how great donors are attuned to and often really good at finding ways of sharing power with their grantees and the communities that they want to serve. Hillary and Sam both wrote outstanding essays in that collection, and I highly recommend it to all of you. It's a really nice complement to the conversation we're going to be having today. Okay, enough of the introduction. Let's get into it. Hillary and Sam, I think I've teed you up about the monograph and your essays, but a lot of folks, we have 220 attendees right now. Probably very few of them have had a chance to read your outstanding essays. Can you just tease them a little bit? Can you just share with us a few of the stories that you really bravely shared, in part because you both have sat on the grant seeking side of the table as well as the grant making side of the table. You have a unique perspective. I call that WINS leadership, walked in nonprofit shoes. You both have done that. Can you share a few stories from your essays?
Sam, you want to go first?
My mother taught me better.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I will start. My essay is about the journey the Ford Foundation took as we created something called the BUILD program, which is an effort to invest with multi-year support, 5-year grants, to a key set of nonprofit partners where they use a portion of that investment to strengthen their organizations and institutions, but the rest is just general support to be who they are and do what they do. Maria Elena is one of the leaders of those organizations. And when we got started, we thought we were a pretty great funder, right? We were proud of ourselves. We thought we had good relationships with our grantees. But as we began to look at the kind of funding we gave them, we were horrified. We had relationships with grantees that lasted for multiple years, and we gave them 1-year grants over and over again, 1-year grants. Most of our grants were project support, so highly specific and restricted. And we realized that kind of behavior was keeping our grantees weak. It was not letting them be full partners with us, and it wasn't giving them the ability to skate ahead of the puck, control some of their own, organizations and resources. So we made what was at the time a very controversial decision inside the foundation. We took money away from program officers. We said, from now on, you are going to spend 40% of your dollars, which of course is not their dollars, in grant making in this way. You choose your grantees that are your key grantees, but we're going to partner with them in a different way. And we're going to start by asking the grantees what they most need. And that was hard in the beginning because it was a loss of a certain kind of control and agency on the part of the program officers, but it has been transformational. We are now 5 years into the program. It has become our grant makers' favorite way of making grants. Now about 70% of all the grants that Ford makes are in this way. And it has transformed the relationship between our grant makers and their grantees, because they now are talking about the whole organization that the leader runs and the kinds of things that keep them up at night. But it was a slow journey for us, not without resistance, and something that we are continuing to try to be really, really honest about as we go along. And hopefully Maria Elena will be honest too, because it's been a learning journey. So I'll start with that and turn it to you, Sam.
Well, thank you. So thanks, Lowell, for the lovely introduction. And so my monograph is really about telling stories about those funders who really invested and helped us achieve success versus those funders who it felt like oftentimes were trying to catch us messing up. And so I tell stories in there about what that actually means for me and what it meant for the old organization that I led, First Place for Youth, which works with young people transitioning out of foster care. And so when I started there, it was a very small organization. I think we had about 17 staff people, a budget of about 1.2 million. More importantly, we were touching about 300 or so kids. When I left, the budget was approaching 30 million. We probably had a staff of about 125 or so. And more importantly, we were touching about 5,000 kids and had expanded not only through the state of California, but really we're now offering services in multiple states. And, you know, I tell stories about how some funders, I'm just going to tease it for you, how some funders talk about the data, but don't really actually pay attention to the data. And when you tell them what the data means, sometimes they don't actually want to hear it. And so, as an example, I tell the story about a funder who called me and said that he couldn't fund me anymore, or couldn't fund me for the first time, because when he looked at our data, he saw that at intake, what the young people reported as was their drug use. And then when we did follow-ups 6 months later, he said drug use rises when kids are in your program. And my response to him was, thanks for looking at the data, but it actually doesn't rise. What we realize is that upon intake, we've given our kids the incentive to lie to us, that if they tell us that they're smoking weed, and you know, we're in the Bay Area, we call it the Yay area, you know, like it is all legal now, but if they feared that if they told us that they were smoking weed, that we wouldn't actually help them. And I make the connection to how that is the same thing that some funders, and not all funders, want to do, versus those funders that I would go to and I would say, okay, here are the issues that we're having. Here are the things that I don't know. And can you help me understand it? And those funders who would actually dig in deeper with me and help me figure out those answers. And that was one of the places that I started to use the slogan that if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. And I love those funders who really wanted me to ask for advice, and not just to placate them, but because I actually really needed it, versus those when things got rough, they ran in the opposite direction. I also talk a little bit about what it's like to lead an organization as a Black man, and the obstacles that you have to overcome with funders when you're doing that, and how just recently I was in a conversation, and you know, a group of philanthropists and people who are in gatekeepers say, well, we have to make sure that that funders realize that funding people who are proximate to the issue, that funding people of color, that is just a higher risk investment. My question is how is funding me higher risk? Right? What does it say? What is my bio? What is my profile? What does it say? What is it that you're looking at and trying to establish that funding me is more riskier than funding someone else? And so I get into those stories and talk about what that was like, and how we actually at the organization had to navigate that. So hopefully that's enough to help you pull it down. And there are also some other fabulous essays in there from Daniel Steed and my good friend Jeffrey Braddock, and he'll in the Nonprofit Finance Fund as well. So.
Mm-hmm.
So Maria Elena, I want to turn to you and ask, Hillary described the intentions of the BUILD program and the concept behind it. You got to see what forward funding was like before you were a BUILD grantee, and now that you are a BUILD grantee, with as much truth telling as you can possibly muster, what's different? And if you had a magic wand, what would you ask them? What would you change that still needs some work?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much, Lowell and Candid, for organizing this event, and Hillary, to you for inviting me to join you on this panel. Wonderful to meet Sam and Martha as well. So it's interesting, as you were describing, Hillary, the build program, the immediate kind of flashback that I had, I was like, oh my goodness, yes, I remember those days where we had multiple Ford project grants with even different end dates and different like proposals. I mean, literally almost all year long, we were drafting either proposals or reports to Ford for different projects that we were being funded for. And, you know, we were fortunate even before the build grant, if I may, Lowell, just to kind of backtrack a little bit, because I think this is a good example of Ford being that really important partner, even before the build grant, where they saw things differently. I became executive director in September of 2008, and a couple of years later, I was approached by our program officer letting me know that the vice president and the president at the time were interested in investing in the fiscal sustainability of some key organizations, and we were one of them, and it was $1 million grant that had restrictions. It was almost like a quasi endowment, and I remember being so, I cried. I mean, I still like just feel the emotions of that, because it really signaled to me, especially as a new executive director, as the first immigrant leading the National Immigration Law Center, the first person of color, especially after I had been so petrified of letting the organization fail financially, that the Ford Foundation believed in my leadership and that believed in the long term. There was something very important about that being specifically for our financial sustainability that signaled this was a long-term relationship. So that's the first thing that I'll say, that I think even before Build, Ford was already starting to explore different ways to invest in our partnership. And then when, so between 2008 and 2015, I remember I was able to grow the organization very, very methodically, 10, 15% at a time. And by 2015, it became really clear to me that we were just so strapped that the needs and the demands on our organization we couldn't keep up, and that we really needed to grow substantially. And I remember having conversations with our partners at Ford about what would it look like. And that's when they approached us and said, you know, we're considering you for a build grant. And what was amazing about that was to be able to think for 5 years, to have the freedom, right? There was something so liberating about, this isn't a project grant, it's not just for the next year, not even for the next 2 years, but really think about the next 5 years. And it was very prescient, because the timing of the build grant, especially for an organization like ours, focusing on immigrants, we had no idea what was going to happen in 2016, but it allowed me to do some planning. I planned for a Clinton administration, I planned for a Trump administration. We were much more prepared, and the vision that I had of where we were going to grow as an organization between 2015 and 2020, we had to actually end up accelerating that in the first 18 months after the 2016 presidential election. And that flexibility, that ability to go to Ford and to be able to say, look, my vision has been to help build a model workplace, right? Our vision isn't just about the external piece, but how do we internally at our organization, how do we model the kind of society that we're fighting for everyone else? And that required like having the ability of the build grant, actually having money set aside, a percentage of our grant set aside specifically to invest in our infrastructure, to invest in our long-term trajectory as an organization, to invest in our staff, to invest in increasing salaries, especially after, again, after the 2016 elections, we had to hire up really quickly. And to be able to compete with our sister organizations who were also doing the same thing, needing to hire litigators, for example, being able to pay much more competitive salaries made a huge difference in terms of our ability to be prepared to lead during the last 4 years, especially. When I think about kind of what could be different with the build grant going forward, or at this moment, is there's something about, and I think a lot of it just has to do with the pandemic and what the last year and couple of months has been like, but there's something about the need to do more learning as a sector. I'm one of those leaders that I don't believe that My role is only, and my responsibility is not only to our organization at the National Immigration Law Center, but to the ecosystem as a whole, and I would say not even just the immigrant rights movement, but our nonprofit sector, our progressive sector as a whole. And so there's, I think, a lot more learning that we could be doing, especially in this moment when the challenges that we're up against with the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the civil strife, uprisings that we're having in the country, we actually all need to up our game, right? Both philanthropy and nonprofit leaders. And there's a lot more learning and questioning that I think we need to do to be able to leap forward to achieve the level of transformational change that we need in our country. So that to me feels a gap that I know Ford has been interested in doing a lot of that with the Build Grantees. And I think there's a lot more that we could do there still.
Hillary,
Could I
please.
say go ahead, Lowell.
No, I want you to jump in.
So, two things on that. So Maria Elena said something very important, because one, the only part of the Build grant that is restricted, where we require a plan from the grantee, is the institutional strengthening part. And the reason for that is we learned that when we just gave grantees general support, they spent it all on doing their mission. They never reinvested it back in themselves because they felt like they weren't allowed to do that. And so we had to explicitly say, it is okay to spend this money on building up your reserves, on raising your salary, on training your staff. And we did ask for a plan for that. And I think that has, so I loved hearing you talk about the ways in which you were able to use that, that kind of plan. And then the question that I have, and this would be for you, Martha and Sam as well, it's always a mixed blessing to have funders convene learning. And so, one of the things we have asked ourselves is, do you wait for the request for that to come from your grantee partners? How can you be respectful of their time, which is so precious? I can remember when I was a grantee leader, you would be drawn into these forced, retreats or meetings or convenings or learning sessions with your funders. And what they seemed to forget was you didn't get money from just one foundation. You had to get money from lots of foundations, and you had to go to all their sessions. So I think when I hear you, it makes me wonder, would there be a way to think about mutual learning, not one funder with grantees, but like all, groups of funders and groups of grantees together. So I'm just curious about the tax on your time, Maria. Like how do you make an invitation like that really serve the purpose you seek and not be a tax?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Hillary, because it's true. I remember there have been times when I could spend all of my time just with funders, different funders, right? All who are having different retreats that I'm helping to inform and give my perspective on the direction that they're heading in. I mean, I think one of the questions I have about that is like, is there a way to structure that so it's not unilateral? It's not the Ford Foundation asking us as grantees to come to a retreat or to a particular learning session, but instead a group of us coming together to decide what is the learning that's needed, how do we shape it, how do we structure it, what's the agenda, really co-developing, co-creating what that learning is. So that it truly is meeting both of our needs, and again, both of the sectoral piece of it, not just one institution, one philanthropy.
I want to.
That's kind of sharing power, right, Sam?
Yeah, I want to make sure that that not only my good friend but my mentor Martha, my lifesaver gets in here. But a couple of things. One is I smiled when you said, Hillary, that there was a portion of the grants that were restricted. And the reason I smile, because I remember early on at my time at First Place that I would go to Daniel, who used to be the CEO of Tipping and the founder of Tipping Point. And his big thing was these unrestricted grants. And I would go to him and I would say, Daniel, can you restrict 50,000 of this? Because we really need a database so that we can track our outcomes, become better at our impact. But if you just gave me $50,000 at the place that my board is in right now, they're going to want me to serve more kids. Yeah. And I will have it will take me too much time and effort to explain that investing this 50 grand over here means we won't serve more kids this year, but we can serve multiple kids. We can serve 6 times as many 3 years down the line, because then we can do different things. And so I love the ability to restrict some of that and understand that. The other thing I will say before Martha gets in around the convenings is that, it's something that we struggle with. Yes, I've been one of those grantees that had to go to multiple convenings. Martha and I once did and it's always like, what is the flavor of the year for philanthropy? But I first started at one of the first presentations that I did at First Place. Martha and I did together for a foundation, and everybody then was talking about succession planning, right? How are you gonna with succession planning? I'm like, look, I just got here. I've been on the job 6 months, and you're already talking to me about where I'm gonna go, right?
Give me a break.
But we were just on a tour, and I had to go everywhere to learn about succession planning. And then, after the 2016 election, like, the flavor of the day was diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we had to go everywhere to learn to every foundation who were using all of the same consultants, who were getting all of the same things. And it was always this required thing to be there. And, there was one foundation who signed us up. They had 5 sessions, and one of them was in Oakland, where we were located, but they signed us up for the New York session. And I was like, why are we going to New York? You're right down the street, right? Why can't we come near? The other thing I say, but also when we think about power sharing, is like, okay, you want me to show up for your stuff? Here's what I need from you, my favorite foundations. Can you host a convening for me?
Right.
Because if you invite your peer funders, they're going to show up. If I host the convening of funders as a nonprofit, they're not going to show up. And so that was also one of our strategies, is that we got our foundation partners to host convenings and learning sessions for us, so that we could talk to their funding peers about what it was that we were doing. And so again, like, it's this relationship that if you need something from me, then I also hope that you're going to respond when I need something from you. But again, I want to make sure that Martha gets in here as well, because I know, again, we did those succession plannings things together, and that was what, 15, 16 years ago. And so.
And Sam, it was appropriate that I was doing those succession plannings back then, because I had already been in it for half the time that I've been here now. And but I think one of the things about those convenings, and the convenings that Tipping Point has, is that they pull us together, grantees, all sort of like-minded, committed individuals, and that really fuels me. However, I would really love the opportunity. I always say that it's so hard to get your foot in the door. And as a founding organization, oh my goodness, with no background in having done this before, building something from scratch, you're always having to prove yourself. And if you have any tapes going on in your head about how you can't do it, it really is, it's hard. And so in the beginning, it was lots of small grants, all restricted grants. And it really wasn't until Tipping Point, and Tipping Point must be about 15 years old now. Yep. And I'm one of your first grantees. And
first.
Okay, thank you. But to have been told that it would be an ongoing grant, that as long as I did what I said that I would do and what they wanted me to do, which was in alignment with our mission, that I would continue to get funding. Now, I didn't get as much as I wanted, but it was funding, and it was there. And it came with the stamp of approval that you made it, that you are an organization that is worthy of Tipping Point's funding. And that went a long way for us. And so, I think that's great. But that said, I got into a little bit of an issue with Tipping Point one time, because they too thought I should be talking about succession planning. And I wasn't ready. Well, you, my age, you'd think so too. But anyway, I wasn't ready. And I realized that it's important to pass that baton on. It's important to have other ideas. It's important to have new leadership in this position. And I tell people I'm here by default, because I was the founder. But so I didn't do what they told me to do. And it came to a point that, I was put on probation, which blew my mind. I thought, my goodness, every time, I get together with them, they're picking my brain for what should they do next. And here I was in the doghouse, and it was hard for me. But it didn't take me long to realize that what they were doing was trying to invest in our infrastructure. And what I was doing was like, any young person starting a nonprofit would want to do was to take care of the problem that there was out there. And so when I realized, I think it's important for us as leaders and funders as well, to allow yourselves to be vulnerable and to always be transparent and to always be honest and to really take that hard look at yourself of what you might be doing wrong, and then acknowledging it. It'll only serve you well in the future. And so I got back in the good graces of Tipping Point, and now I'm working closely with my friend and colleague, Sam. So it's great.
Martha, I admire what you just said so much. And, one thing that's been really interesting to me, because I was a founding executive director leader too of Jobs for the Future, which I ran for 20 years. Almost a quarter of our Build grantees, once they get that grant, a long-serving, often founding executive director, usually white, usually male, decides they can retire. It's like you can almost feel the founder breathe a sigh of relief and think, okay, it's okay. I can go now. And very, very often, the people who replace them are young leaders and often co-directors, just whole different leadership models, and often leaders of color. And so I think that's it's sort of interesting that you have to put your money where your mouth is when you talk to organizations about succession planning.
I'd like to build on this great vein of truth telling that we have going on. We don't need to name names. We're not trying to out people for shame reasons, but we're trying to out lousy practices. Martha, perhaps start with you. 32 years, you've got a lot of war stories about the opposite of power sharing, power hoarding. Are you willing to share one or two?
Sure. I'll share a story of a foundation that gave us money consistently year after year, and the head of the trust, it was a family foundation, they gave us $50,000 a year, and the head was an elderly white male, and he came to every site visit, and he would sit down with us, and he loved the work that we did with families, and he loved that the kids were born healthy. And he asked us one time what we were going to use, each time he did, but he asked us this one time what we were going to use our money for, and we said that we were planning on using it to help raise the voices of the women that we were serving, women who are African American, women who had had poor adverse birth outcomes, so that they could speak the truth and tell people what was wrong, and hopefully the hospitals and clinics and others would pay attention, listen, and change their ways. And this man said, that sounds too militant for me. And so I was shocked, because there was not an ounce of militancy in that. But what we were doing was just trying to give power to people who had never had it before. Power so that they could raise their voice and they could actually tell the truth of what was happening to them. And how did that maybe hold us back? It took a lot of work for us to go back and educate this man about why we wanted to do what we did. We had to write reports, we had to, and it's like we did it because it was important for us to have this money. It would have been a loss. It wasn't like we were flush. We needed the money, and it was important to be able to do this. The woman he worked with at the foundation, she understood us completely. So we had her help and support too. So that was one that I thought that, he was going to pull it away from us because he didn't like the sound of it. Another quick story is we have a budget now of $14 million. We started with a budget of $52,000. So 32 years later, we're $14 million. And we get, I believe in addition. Everything adds up. I'm grateful for whatever I get from whoever I get it, as long as it's reasonable. And so we get this grant for $5,000 from a foundation. What did we have to do for it? quarterly reports, intense reports, and it wasn't worth it to me. You know, it's like that took too much time of my staff, my time, to be able to respond to that. So those are things that, and I have stories of people who share as well over the years that I have met and have really contributed to the growth of our agency. But those are a couple of stories where people have really just sort of held on to their dollars and, no, this is what I'm going to do with it, not that.
Maria Elena, what about you?
I'm going to pick up right where Martha left, which is, so I'll give two examples. So one is the smaller funders. It has never ceased to amaze me that the smaller the grant, the more hoops you have to jump through. I mean, it really is mind-boggling. And I think for the same reason as you mentioned, Martha, especially in my early years as an executive director, and I think because I grew up in a low-income family, I count every penny, every dollar, and it all adds up. I mean, my parents earned minimum wage, but they eventually were able to buy a house, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, it all adds up in my mind. And you know, just to know that the same amount of work, and actually sometimes so much more, right? The grant, the application process being so much more complicated, the requirements for the, I had one funder wanted to have monthly phone calls to provide the reports on what the progress on the work was. There seems to be a pattern that I've just found over the years that the smaller the grant, the more hoops you have to jump through. And then the other example I would give is a large foundation that who wanted to provide rapid response funding and we've had many, as you can imagine, on immigration, a lot of moments over the last 20 years where like, we need to do something, we need to respond. There's either a crisis or an incredible opportunity, although all crises in my mind are opportunities. And you would get this call of like, there's an opportunity, we can move money really quickly. You need to get a grant proposal in this week, or like with some crazy time frame of like in the matter of days, weeks. And so we would do everything, even if it meant, I mean, I was up at 2 a.m. writing proposals, reviewing proposals, and then you submit it and silence for weeks.
Hurry up and wait.
Yeah, and you're like, seriously, this opportunity that we all need to respond to right now, the crisis, the demand, you see it, like for us, it's palpable. Like we are seeing our communities suffer. And you're telling me, first, I just sidetracked everything I was doing to submit this proposal. And then second, here we are waiting and we can't plan, we can't respond to the moment. And I can't tell you how many of those examples there are. And unfortunately, those larger foundations have many more resources to be able to move, but it ends up impacting the entire ecosystem, because here you were thinking, and the fact is, like, then we would shift things around to be able to be responsive, because at the end of the day, I'm going to do the work that our communities need us to do, regardless of whether we have the funding. I've always believed the funding will follow the work. But those two extremes of small money and a lot of hoops, and then the other piece is like, yes, there's a great opportunity, move forward. And again, I often, when there were those moments of opportunities and crises, my approach has always been to not just raise money for the National Immigration Law Center, but for a whole set of partners. And so then you have an entire movement waiting for this funding to come along. And it just takes so much organizing from our end to get some funders to move, rather than the other way around. I think to Sam's earlier point, which is having funders organize other funders to come along. And it just, those have been really frustrating over the years.
I'm tempted to take this in an interesting new direction. I'm curious from Maria Elena and Martha, when you have, so, we're talking about stories that fit into the bucket of lousy practice. We're going to talk about the opposite, some wonderful power sharing, like really at the cutting edge. But there's sort of an interesting, I'd like to get your perspectives on when you've converted a funder from old style practices of exactly the type that you've described, lots of dumb hoops to jump through that aren't helping anyone learn or improve, going from project grants to general operating support grants, a wide array of different, more respectful practices. How have you converted? How have you shifted funders? Are there cases where you think you have been successful doing that?
Martha, do you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I'm not so sure that I've been that successful at doing that. What I love is when funders actually see the light themselves. And there was a funder very early on in our evolution here as an organization. And he worked at a California foundation, and he saw the light. He said it has to be multi-year, it has to be unrestricted money, general fund, and that was great. I think that, you know, for me, I have sort of like grown up doing this work, and so I have not, I wasn't schooled in it really, and so I sort of like accept, you know, I'm respectful, stand back, I don't grovel, but I do, I'll do very respectful of what you do. And as I get older, as longer I stay here, I can push the envelope a little bit more. But I love it when the funders are able to come to you. And usually, even though it's a general fund, there's something that you have to show impact for, which I totally agree, because it's really important to be able to continue to move that dial in a positive direction for the people that we're serving. I'll hand it to you, Maria Elena.
Thanks, Martha. So it's interesting. I don't think I converted folks for our work, but because over the years we have helped to raise funds for other grassroots partners or organizations that we became fiscal sponsors for that were grassroots organizations, and because I think I also kind of grew up in the role. As I got more comfortable in my own, position, I was able to advocate for others, right? To be like, hey, funder A, B, C, you know, this grassroots organization that is Black immigrant led or undocumented led, or, you know, Muslim, Arab, South Asian groups where there's like such little capacity. What you're asking them to do is just not realistic, you know, and like, and so that's one piece, is really being at a place now where our organization has grown so much. Like we went from a $2 million, when I took on the ED role, went from a $2 million organization to now a $20 million organization. So I've been able to use kind of my positional power with funders to be like, do not do that to those small organizations, right? Like that doesn't make sense. And then the other piece I think is, and this is where I think going back to the partnership and leveraging our strengths as an organization and as philanthropy, is like, I've also really believed in investing in my relationships with philanthropy and really use my time of educating funders as a way to help move money to the movement, right? And to really to the broader ecosystem. And so part of that, all of those meetings that I've had, especially when it's a group of funders and going to funders to share, like, here's what we're experiencing as a sector. There's a little bit of safety in that, to be able to be like, here's what our movement, our sector is experiencing. Here's what the groups are experiencing. And then the flip of that is, over the years, because so many of these are foundations, we have the same program officers, I've developed a long-term relationship. And so there is that trust, there is that vulnerability to be able to say, listen, what you're asking us to do right now, we don't have the capacity. I mean, there have been times when I'm like, my staff literally I can't ask them to do that. And so being able to have that and to be very, very vulnerable, I think has been one of the lessons I've learned, where I have been able to go to our senior program officer at Ford, for example, and to be really honest about like, hey, here's what we're experiencing internally and why I can't do this. And I've learned over the years that vulnerability has actually served me well. I find that a lot of executive directors are so afraid to be vulnerable with their philanthropic partners. And I think it goes back to that trust piece, and that relationship where there's, I've learned that actually has helped me. Whereas I think for others, they feel like when they have been vulnerable, it actually has hurt them sometimes. So that's hard.
That's such
Oh, please go ahead, Martha.
So I was just going to say, that's such a complicated thing that you're just raising, Maria Elena. So I had a similar experience as a grant seeker, and I love, Martha, that you use the word grovel. You know, what's so painful sitting on the funder side of the table is when someone comes in to meet with you and you have 30 minutes or an hour and they just talk the whole time because they're so nervous and they're so trying to sell their organization and it matters so much to them. And you just want to say, oh, stop. You know, can I figure out how to make this a conversation that's real? And I try to use my own experience to just disrupt that. But I think there is a kind of power. You are, of course, we all have to be realistic. These are not equal power dynamics. But I think grantees have more power than they think they have. You know how to actually get the work done that the foundations seek to advance, and you know what's happening. And I think it's too rare that people, that grant seekers, it's too rare that they show up in the way you just are each describing, saying, no, that's not the best way to do it. There's a story your senior program officer was telling me before this of you coming in, Maria Elena de Ford, and telling her and her vice president and her director what was wrong with our strategy. I don't know if you remember that time, but they really respected you for that, because and grantees should do that. I mean, you know better than we know often about our strategies. So I think the thing that makes it succeed or makes it safe enough is that you have some base level of trust that you, or I'm asked, at least in my experience, you do have to have some basic level of trust in order to step out there like that. But I think that more people could step out a little bit further than they feel like they can, and not have it backfire. I'm sure there are cases where it does, but on the whole, I don't know. What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, I totally agree, and so I think there's a level of trust and confidence that you have to have, and so even as we started to have this conversation and around power sharing, I really didn't like the title of it, because to me it felt like we were going in and we were replicating what it was that we were trying to solve, and we were already saying that one group of people had power over the other one, and that this group of people had power over the other one because they had money and they had resources. And so I've never gone into a situation, and just because someone had money, that I felt like they actually had power over me, right? And so I think what I loved about some of the stories that Martha told, especially the one where she wanted to raise the voices of people that had voice, but just hadn't been able to get into the rooms to use them. But that when the funder said, "Oh no, I can't," you can't do that. She didn't just shift and say, "Okay, we won't do that," right? She used her power to say, like, we're going to continue to push you and explain to you why this is important. Yes, it took more work than she wanted it to do, but she didn't relinquish her power. The way I've always felt is that this is a mutually beneficial relationship, that funders, they need to give away money. They need to invest in things. I always viewed myself and the organizations that I ran as a good investment. And so if you want to be good stewards of the dollars, then I am going to do you a favor and take your dollars from you and put them to good use. And then you're going to do me a favor by continuing to give me dollars and pay me for my performance, not because I am your best friend, right? And not because all of my stuff is so slick. And so I think those are the things that I've always talked to my peers about around, how do you, instead of how do you share power, I like to think about how do you build authentic relationships with people. So the best class that I ever went through was when I went to community college, and it was a relationship class. And the title of the book, which I still have over here, was called "Do I Have to Give Up Me to Be Loved by You?" And the whole piece was around that intimate relationships, important relationships, are formed because there is conflict. And there is conflict because no one is giving up their power to the other person. In that the great relationship is not that you are conflict free, but it is how do you work through that conflict that strengthens that relationship. And so I think as a funding community, as a group of philanthropists, if we begin to understand that what we're really trying to do is build authentic relationships. And for those of us who have served young people and clients, we all know it's about building authentic relationships with you. Because if you haven't served the person, if you haven't had a kid, you will know that you can't make your kid do nothing, especially when you're trying to potty train them. I remember my old boss when she had her first kid. I was like, she was a grinder. She was by sheer will that she was going to get and make happen what she needed to happen. And because I had kids first, I was like, well, I can't wait until she experiences potty training. And so that when she's going to realize that you actually have no power, right? And so how do you get, and that's why I think leaders like Martha and Marilana are terrific, because I think it was in Jim Collins' book that he said true leaders are found in the nonprofit sector and maybe in the government sector, because true leaders are the people who can get people to do what it is that they're asking them to do and what they need them to do when they have free will to do entirely something different, right? And so this is where that leadership and that ability comes from. And how I think about power sharing is, how do you develop authentic relationships with people that you can tell them what's great, you can tell them what is not so great, and that you're going to dig in that together because you're in this relationship to come out on the other end in a successful way.
So I'm going to invite a little bit of that relationship conflict in here, because I know, Martha, you have a slightly different perspective, just based on our previous conversation, that Sam's got two legs to stand on to say everything he did. But you made the point that even 32 years in, there are times when that power dynamic is, you're not ceding power, but when you get put on someone's probation list, they're taking some power from you. So help us understand your perspective.
Well, that's true. And I must say that, it was sort of like a sucker punch in some ways, but it was something I needed to hear. And so, and I can go there because I think it's important. But there's no question that when we're not on equal footing, but the fact that we're having this conversation is fantastic, because we're moving in a direction that we need to be moving in. There are people out there, there are many, many nonprofits, probably too many nonprofits, really. People are starting, and there are a lot of good people want to do good work, but there are some people who've been doing their work for 20, 30 years, and they still can't get their foot in the door of someplace. And they don't have any power whatsoever. And yet they are doing fabulous work. People call me frequently and they'll ask me, if I can help them. How can I help them raise money? How can I help them get in front of somebody? And I recently met with a woman on Zoom who runs 2 residential programs for homeless pregnant women. And the Medi-Cal has decided that you only need 3 months of Medi-Cal support for drug rehabilitation. Well, after 3 months, that's when the fog lifts and you all of a sudden can see where you are, and you know that you have a lot of work ahead of you. And so she's dependent on finding things from other people, but she can't get her foot in the door. And so, like you, Maria Elena, I try. It's easier for me to go to bat sometimes for people who don't have anything than it is for me to go to bat for myself that has been able to actually develop a reputation in the community for the work that we do that people will now fund. But it wasn't always that way. And while I never did grovel, but I did ask. And you hate to hear no, and you do hear it. And I have come to realize that people have that right, and especially individuals, that if they don't want to give to you, that's their right. But you just got to move on and find the people who believe in the work that you're doing and who believe in the potential of the people that you're serving. And those are the ones that you have to continue to work on. I mean, I recently bit off something pretty large for our organization. We own the building we currently live in, and we've paid it off. And right next door to us is another building. And we just bought it. And we bought it because for 10 years I had been looking out the window, and anytime I did a site visit, I'd tell the funder, we're going to buy that building someday and we're going to build housing. Well, we need affordable housing more than anything, but housing alone is not enough. We've got to realize, I think as we travel this journey in the nonprofit world, we find out what people need and don't need. And it's because we listen to them, they tell us. And I would hope that funders would then turn around and listen to us so that we could all work in partnership to support the families. So our goal now is to build 100% affordable housing for families. I borrowed the money to buy the building. I don't have it. But on the ground floors to put services. and to put job training services. I don't have to run those job training services. They just have to be services that will provide a skill or help someone go on to get their education, that will provide for a job with a living wage. And I sort of went off track here, but I think that, you know, it's this, it's going to cost me about $15 million to do my portion. The housing developer will raise their own money, but it's not going to be easy. But having this conversation now, where we're talking about an equal footing, and where people are now listening more to grantees, funders are, than they did before, I think is incredibly optimistic. And I remain hopeful for the sector in general. But there really is, it's not an equal, we're not equal. We just can't be. And I always say, just look out in the street, there's homeless people, there are people living in their cars, there are people who have nothing. And there are people who have so much that they don't need it. And some people have so very little. And we just have to be able to shift a little bit more. But the more we shift, the closer we get. So I remain hopeful.
So a couple of things, Lola. I just want to introduce a couple of other pieces into this. One is, you know, it was horrible that Martha had to get on probation. The other thing that I see is that, you know, I've had funding taken away from me without any rationale or reason or ways to have a conversation about it. And so it was a horrible thing. But as she said, at least there was a conversation around, like, this is where there was a conflict. This is where we're not meeting up. And hopefully let's come to an agreement of how we can meet up versus one of us, the funder, taking their ball from the playground and going home. Right. And so painful situation, but you know, and I knew about the situation because Martha, we still are peers, right? We talked about it. She was like, Sam, I cannot believe this. For those, some of you may not know, like Martha in Homeless Prenatal actually kept me from being evicted at one point when I wasn't in the position that I was in. And so the other thing is that one of the other conversations was about impact, because I believe that impact in the beginning, when we started the philanthropic space and the nonprofit space started to go down this path of like, let's create more outcomes, let's create more impact. I got lucky to go into my organization right as that movement was really getting ready to happen, because for me, that began to level the playing field, right? It was still about what doors I could get into, but I always knew that my outcomes and my impact would actually speak for me if I could actually get through those doors. And one of the things that my monograph talks about is that, yeah, dollars still flowed unequitably and unequally to the Ivy League white guys who had inferior impact and outcomes, but they actually had those connections. And I'm not saying that solves it all, but I think the other thing that I say is the most unequitable thing now is because of the way that has developed. And we have conversations. We have an initiative focused on just funding people of color, right? Who are in early to mid-stage organizations. And the reason we're doing that is because as that movement began to happen, and this happened at Tipping Point, that we only began to fund those organizations that had already made it, right? That could bring us the outcomes that we were seeking, that were already getting those outcomes. But we didn't invest in those organizations to help them build that infrastructure, to help them change that culture. It's not just having a database does not help you collect data and use it effectively to create greater outcomes and impact for the clientele. And what I hear my other philanthropic partners now say, well, you know, the leaders of color, they don't want to collect and use data. My response is, no, that is not the answer. The answer is that no one has helped them actually build that infrastructure. I think, Lowell, one of the first conversations we had, I would always use the quote that everybody wants my data, nobody wants to pay for it. Right. So how do you help organizations do that? And so I think one of the greatest unequitable things now is that foundations, philanthropy, aren't helping people build that infrastructure so that they can collect that data, so that they can level the playing field just a little bit, that their impacts speak for others. And I think as it goes back to Martha, because she wasn't the only person talking to me about during that time, Tipping Point was talking to me as well. And my response to them was like, look, Martha will get there when she gets there. The more you push her, she didn't get to where she is because she's going to relent to you and do what it is that you say you do. I said, the other thing is, as you're pushing her around the infrastructure and the data, Martha stopped me from being evicted. I'm not going to show up in her data anywhere. Right? And so how do we go beyond the data to actually understand the quality of the programs that we're actually seeing, and to quantify that as well? Because, 13, 14, 15, 20 years later, I know the story. Nobody else knows the story. And you know what? I'm not showing up in her. I'm not going to show up in her data. That she is probably one of the main reasons that I am where I am, because that eviction would have led to homelessness, would have led to me losing my job, would have led to me making decisions that I needed to do to pay the rent at that moment versus making decisions for the long term for myself and my family.
There's no question that made you who you are, Sam. You are who you are because of who you are. But I will say that incident actually helped me really build an evaluation team. And we have a very robust evaluation team now. And we didn't earlier because I was all about, helping people from becoming evicted and helping moms have healthy babies and help people exit homelessness and change the trajectory for their families. But you have to know what works and what doesn't work. And if you don't evaluate it, you're not going to know. And it's okay. I love mistakes and that was a mistake I made really with Tipping Point. But I love mistakes. And as long as you only make them once, make them twice, you're in trouble. But because you learn so much from them. And you learn so much from when the data shows you that it's not working. Don't take it personally. Just pay attention and try to change it, really. If it's not working, it's not working. And that's really something to be reckoned with.
Yeah. So I would be remiss. So I want to bring we have over 200 people here. I know there's going to be some great questions, but I want to end with one of my own to invite all of you, each of you, to share at least one practice that you have seen in a funder that really delighted you, that was creative, was innovative, was a way of sharing power. Sorry, Sam, I'm still going to use that expression, in a way that surprised you and was really quite effective at helping to build that trust relationship we're all talking about. Anything come to mind?
I mean, I'll start, Lowell, just because actually several funders have done this in the last few years. So immediately after the 2016 presidential election, and then immediately when the pandemic kicked off, in those two instances, we had a couple of funders who basically just literally called and said, you know what, we know that you are going to play a really critical role in this moment. We're just going to augment your grant. That was shocking. I mean, it was just like, really? And they were like, yeah, like, don't even just, and it was simple. It was like, just send a couple of paragraphs, or even just like, here's some paperwork you just have to fill out. We'll take care of it on our end. That's one. The second one that I've seen, and I think this has become a little bit more, I've seen a number of other funders do this in the pandemic, is rather than a grant report, let's just have a phone call and you can report verbally on your work and we'll figure it out on our end. Like that, again, at a time when the pandemic, especially when I think about our staff, working parents, just all the difficulties that the pandemic has provided, to know that the load is being lightened in different ways has been really just very, very welcome.
Great.
I'll give you a couple of stories too, one very early on and one recently. Very early on, the first funder I had, a wonderful woman, Ruth Brousseau, she's with the San Francisco Foundation. Thank God that the grant landed on her desk. And so she gave us, worked with me for about a year so I could figure out, what it was that would work. But what was I going to do afterwards? So it was a 3-year grant. And what she did was is she went out there to her colleagues in the community and told them about us. She opened doors for us that would have never been opened before, because I don't think I would have known how to do that back then. And so I think that that was really a beautiful thing that she did. And I think that that's something that I wish funders would do more of. Sam, when you brought up the point, I think it was you that said that bringing funders together along with grantees, it's really important, so you can break bread together, you can share what you're doing, you can learn from them and grow together. Another example is also during the pandemic, to have a funder call me and just give me a lot of money, and then to call me back again and say, so who should we fund? I thought, wow, that is really great. And so I could really think about who in the community was not getting the dollars they needed to serve the community, and give it to this woman, and she would actually give them money. And then lastly, I had another funder who called, and she said, we want to give you $500,000 for random acts of kindness. So that meant that we could give 450 families $500 each to spend on whatever they needed. And many of them are undocumented families who have absolutely no rights, no income, they've lost their jobs, they've lost everything, and they're just struggling to actually survive. And then, of course, our poor homeless African-American families as well. It was a gift that was unbelievable to be able to.
It's great.
Great.
And what about our WINS leaders? Hillary.
Well, I was going to say what Maria Elena said about verbal rather than written reports, but I think the general principle of the foundation doing the work rather than the grantee,
Yes,
I really love. One thing we've also tried to do is just speed up our grant making decisions, to the point you were making earlier. Like, why can't we get better and hold ourselves accountable for, during COVID, we made some grants, it took a week between requesting the proposal, getting it and getting the money out the door. So I think the practice of getting ourselves to feel urgency about how fast we can move would be one. And then another that I would add, I remember when I ran Jobs for the Future, I was trying to figure out what our overhead rate was. I didn't actually really know what it cost us to do the work we did, because I was just told by funders that my overhead rate was 15%. That's what they were willing to give me to do everything that we did. And I remember the Gates Foundation was one of our funders. They had Bridgespan, do work with us. And I asked Bridgespan, like, can you help us figure out what our overhead rate is? And I remember getting together with other nonprofit leaders of similar organizations, and none of us knew. We just pretended we didn't have one. And so it meant that when we went to a funder with a proposal and we said, we want to do, let's just say, make it simple, we want to do an event, and it's going to cost us $100,000. And they said, well, no, we'll give you 50. We would just take 50. So I think there is a growing practice now. It's a little technical, but for funders to try to help, they are beginning to try to help organizations figure out what their true overhead cost rate is, and to understand that it's probably closer to 30% than 15%. And let's just normalize that. Why do we pretend it doesn't cost money to run our organizations? And why wouldn't we want to know what it actually takes to deliver the service we deliver or the advocacy work we do? So I think that's a promising trend, because the 15%, it's all this false kind of accountability, which is really disrespectful and inaccurate, and in the long run unproductive. So I named a couple.
Yeah, I would just say that yes, and ditto to all of that. Like, we have done, when I say me, we, the philanthropic, the communities, government has done amazing things that before people said couldn't be done, but somehow we figured out how to do it over the last year, right? Like, somehow, without building anything, we found over 3,000 vacant places in San Francisco, right, for homeless people. Somehow they just magically appeared. Like, they weren't there before, because if they were there before, then we would have had people in them. And so I'm being very facetious here. And so we were able to do a lot of things in the same way that my philanthropic colleagues, they were able to get money in and get it out really quickly, right? Without having these 6 months or 3 months or whatever lag that you had, right? And so I think, how do we not return to those normals of that we understand where the foundations are actually doing the work because we have the staff to do it. And so, during COVID, we asked our current grantees to tell us what we were going to do with the money if we gave you COVID emergency grants, because and we actually did restrict those because we wanted them to go for specific things around COVID. But we also funded 50 organizations that we had never funded before. And we didn't ask them for anything. We just called them and told them that, send us your banking information, a check is on the way. Right. And so being able to not bog them down with that level of work. The other story I would tell, and Martha is also at the center of this story, is that there was a point in time where one of Martha's board members, who I knew, gave me a call and said, Sam, can I get your CFO to mentor and work with the CFO at Homeless Prenatal? And I said, well, I don't know what that means. Let's have a conversation about it. And what the conversation led to was that what it was that she wanted the CFO at Homeless Prenatal to get was the same thing that I wanted my CFO to get, which wasn't a really great thing. And which was that what we both had hired is that we had hired really great accountants that would keep us out of trouble with audits and to make sure all of our systems were in place. But what we didn't have was the strategic financial person to help us, not just help us understand where we spend our money and if we spend it right, but to also help us understand where we need to spend our money, and was that third kind of leg on the stool to come together with program and operations to do that. And so when we discussed that, we said, this is not a Martha issue or first place issue, this is a field issue. And so then we went back to a funder and said, this is a field issue. We think you should do something about it. And they hired our colleague Hilda Palenka and her organization to come in and say, okay, here's how you begin to nonprofits think about your finances in a different way. Here's how you break down the language from your development. And it was an all-inclusive overall organizational perspective. And so being able to be community-led, to listen, to say, hey, here is where the sector needs your help. And will you come to the table to help the sector, which will then help your grantees. And so those are some of the practices that I've seen and where those things have been transformed. And then finally, I'm still working on the statement is that, as we say, listen to community. Well, if you hire people from community, you're always listening to community. You don't have to do tons of focus groups. If you hire people from community, you're always listening to community. You're always including community. And so I will always say that before I got the tipping point, I never got an announcement about a philanthropic job that was open. After I got to tipping point, in the first 3 months, every week I had an announcement. And we talk about the diversity of philanthropy. And so if we know that that our sector is like 94% white, and if we continue to recruit from that 94% of the people that are already there, that we're not going to get to where we go, not only from a diversity perspective, but truly listening and valuing community isn't just doing a focus group. It is bringing them in and giving people a seat at the table. And as I say, we're not giving people voice. People have always had voice. They just can't get in the door to use them. And that is what philanthropy's entree is for.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. I think I need to turn it over to Savannah and to Yvonne to make sure we hear from this community.
Yes, absolutely. We have some great questions coming in. Since we don't have that much time, I'm going to try to get to the ones that are directly for some of our panelists. So the first one, Miguel has a question for Hillary. The question is, what changes did you see in grantee organizational capacity and innovation as a result of changing from multiple one-year grants to multi-year grants with operational support and capacity building?
So many changes. I mean, we saw people build up their reserves. We saw people hire for functions that they needed that they hadn't had before, like a financial officer with strategic financial acumen, development people. We also, from a programmatic and an impact point of view, I think the most exciting thing was that grantees were able to be first movers in an opportunity or a crisis. They didn't have to come to us and say, would you please give me money so that I can, go put out that fire. They were able to just do what they felt that they needed to do and then tell us later. And so all of those things have been really, really important. We used to use the word that we thought we were trying to strengthen organizations, which we were, but we now say we're trying to help them be resilient. Any organization can be strong in one time and less strong in another time, but resilience it's not like a vaccine. It's not like you get a one-time, 5-year grant and you're good to go forever. So we're learning together with our grantees what helps them be resilient. And resiliency comes with just having some stuff that's a little extra, whether that, so I'd say all of those things have been lessons that we have been learning and are continuing to learn. Succession would be another use of the funds to build up and bring up younger leaders. All of those kinds of things.
That is wonderful to hear. And it kind of leads to another question. Someone asked about how are you educating other funders? How are you passing on the word? Is that word getting passed on about how to do things better?
I was just sitting here looking at the 190 people that are on, so thinking, I hope there's a lot of funders on this call. So we're trying, the piece that Sam and Lowell and I were talking about before is one way. Ford is working really, really hard to try to increase the number of funders who do this kind of work. I've been sitting here thinking that it's hearing Maria Elena and Martha that is the most effective thing that we could possibly be doing. And I've been wondering, how could we do this more? Just show these kinds of conversations. But and then I would also say, Lowell has a hypothesis. You call it, what did you call it, wins leader? The foundation. So there's a tension, do we need to just show more evidence that if you make grants this way, you're going to have a bigger impact? Or is it really a question of hearts and minds, what funders fundamentally believe? And Lowell's hypothesis is the more foundations that hire as their leaders, people who have been nonprofit leaders and who put on their board people who are nonprofit leaders, like a Brian Stevenson or Ijen who are on the Ford Foundation board, the more likely they are to just believe it's good to do this. So I think we have to work on both things, changing the mental model of who foundation presidents should be and what equips you to be a good one, and building an evidence base. And then, we will go anywhere and we'll talk to anyone, anytime, in any way to try to get the word out. We still are learning what's most effective. And Lowell, you and any of you probably would have great answers to that question as well.
I'm just going to put in a blatant plug and give you an email. I am working on something just like this with Hillary right now. And so I would love to hear your stories. Anyone who's taken the time to be part of this conversation today, stories of great practice, what I in my own mind called yes funders, and also the opposite, no funders, dumb hoops, not helpful. So if you've got stories that we can help share with some interesting platforms that Hillary and I are working on, we would love to. My email address is lweiss, W-E-I-S-S, so you can see there at cascadephilanthropy.org. Sorry, it's a long URL.
No, thank you. Savannah will put it in the chat and we'll send it in the follow-up email as well. So thank you. A question from Maria Elena and Martha. Kevin is curious if funders have been listening differently this year. Did you really feel a change? Did you feel like there was progress? And we can start with Martha.
Without a doubt. Everybody was affected by the pandemic, and so this is the first time that I can remember in years that funders came out and did exactly what Maria Elena and I just said. They gave more money, they asked for less reporting, and they trusted us. They trusted us that we would be giving the money from, like Tipping Point has always said they wanted the money to go from them to us to the pockets of the people that we were serving. And that's what we did. And so, yes, funders were, it was you know, it was a silver lining in some ways. It's been a terrible, tough year for so many, and yet people did come out. They wanted to help. People had more money to give too.
Yeah, I would just add, so definitely saw the difference, and I really hope it's what we keep up, right? Because there are a couple of things that happened over the last year, in addition to what I just shared. One is, especially because it's not just the pandemic, but it's the economic crisis and the racial inequities that now the country is really reckoning with. I found at least 2 foundations that I know of who are going through a process of thinking about what their future philanthropic giving is going to be like. They actually had advisory groups made up of community members so that they were directly hearing from community groups about what that direction of that funding would be. So that's one piece. And then the second piece, at a very just personal level, I had funders calling just to say, hey, how are you? How are you keeping up with this? How is your team? And again, when it goes back to that authentic relationship, that trust building, that just the reminder of we're seeing each other as human beings, as community members, that goes a long way as well.
Thank you so much. And that kind of leads to what's probably going to be our final question. And I will send the questions form just so our audience knows to Lowell, and hopefully we can share it and see if we can get answers for you beyond this and send it with a follow-up. But the final question comes from Alex. Alex wants to know, is it really possible to have an authentic relationship with a foundation when foundations are pretty much holding the wealth and the power structure is, old dead white guy, so are we really able to shift ideas and minds and really think about giving this money to people so different, where it isn't just a handout, but a real shift in power? Do we think that's possible?
Well, if I can, go ahead,
I'll
Sam.
be first to take that one. And so, yes, I think it's possible. And the reason I think it's possible because Tipping Point has a unique model. We are a philanthropic organization, but we also raise all of our money. And, one of the things that I was told was never work for, if you're going to go into philanthropy, never work for someone who's living. And what I decided to do was to actually have a board of directors who underwrites all of our operating costs. I got about 30 of them, and I have a leadership council that is primarily the people who give as well as others. And so what I have seen is that with the right understanding, right, and again is walking into a conversation, not handicapping yourself by already feeling that you're one down, but walking into a conversation saying that you being actually confident that what it is that you are offering is the best eking stuff, is that the word you use, ever. And being able to make sure that you can actually back that up with your data and the impact that you're making. And so, yes, I do believe that it is possible to change. At the same time, I do think you have to replace some of those foundation boards, some of those trustees that are on the boards that have been sitting there for a very long time. One of the stories really quickly that I like to tell is I had a conversation with Justin Steele, who was then just head of Google.org for the Bay Area. And within the first 10 minutes, Justin knew that he wanted to fund my organization. But it took us another 2 hours to figure out where we fit. And it wasn't because it was the program officer that needed to do that. It was actually because he had to convince someone else that this was worthy of funding. And so I think I do see it shifting. I do see it changing. I think you have a whole lot of performative groups out there that are foundations as well as corporates that are making these grand statements, and then because they feel pressured to, and then nothing is actually coming behind those. Nothing is then coming behind those statements. And I don't think it's going to happen quickly. But I think just walking in and having an understanding. I remember when I met my first billionaire, I was really impressed when I met him. And then when I got to talk to him, I realized that he probably is a billionaire because his family made money off of the backs of my people. And that just because he's a billionaire does not mean that he's smarter than me, does not mean that he knows more than me. It just means that he started with, more than me. And if I can turn nothing into 5 cents, then maybe I'm a lot smarter than he is. So not going into those situations in a one down approach.
Wow. I feel like
So when I
that's kind
say
of a
my
drop.
people, I mean my family.
Mm-hmm. Yours
Specifically.
Wow. Thank you. I feel like that's a drop the mic moment. I'm not sure, Lowell, if you wanted to say one more thing. We are recording, so I know some people may have to go. But if you want to just wrap it up, and then I'll thank everyone.
I'm just going to say this was an effing great conversation. And Maria Elena, I want to give you the last words because I know you had something you wanted to share.
Oh, geez, I do think that was a drop the mic moment. I mean, what I'll say is the following, and I think I, like Martha, don't necessarily agree with Sam on the power dynamics being equal, because I think we all, for many different reasons, walk into our roles, whether it's gender, whether it's class, whether, whatever it is. And I know that for a long time as executive director, I had one funder was very honest with me, and she said, look, the word on the street among funders is that you don't know how to ask for money. You don't ask for enough money. You need to channel your inner white guy. And I was like, what the hell does that mean? I don't know how to be a white guy. And they were able to share with me like some sample, took blacked out whatever, redacted anything that was identifying, but like some sample budgets, some sample proposals, et cetera. They were just tools, skills that allowed me. And what it prompted was not just the tools, but it prompted me to really question, like, what did that mean? What was I carrying with me around power dynamics? And it honestly was part of a healing journey that I embarked upon that really was about why was I, as a young Latina, as a woman of color, as an immigrant, someone who did not feel I belonged, although I was now a naturalized citizen, dealing with my childhood sexual abuse, like all these things that I embarked on a healing journey to get to a place where I do believe now, and I can come into these relationships from a place of power. I'm hopeful, just on this last question, I do believe it's possible. And I think it's possible because we are going through a transformational change in the world right now that's forcing all of us, all of our institutions, to question how we've done the work up until now and what we need to do differently and what relationships we need to engage in so that we can bring about the change. And I think that philanthropy, as long as philanthropy does start to represent more of the communities we are needing to invest in, I do believe that we all need to do our own individual power, work with power and our own healing, but I do believe that our institutions will change because we need to change.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here and letting us host this really important conversation. I think we may have a part 2, so everyone stay tuned. So again, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your time, and thank you for our attendees being here. Thanks again, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It was really great. Terrific.
Thank you all.
I love you.